What happened to World War II? Submarines after the war. August 15th, 1945. The war is over. Across the world's oceans, hundreds of submarines, the steel predators that stalked the depths for years, suddenly have no enemy to hunt. These underwater warriors had changed naval warfare forever. But what happened to them when the guns fell silent? This is the untold story of the submarine fleets that fought World War II and the fascinating, sometimes tragic fates that awaited them in the peace that followed. By the end of World War II, nearly 3,000 submarines had been built by all nations combined. The Germans alone deployed over 1,100 U-boats. The Japanese Imperial Navy operated the most technologically diverse submarine fleet ever assembled, and the United States Submarine Force, though only 2% of the Navy, had destroyed over 60% of Japan's merchant fleet. But victory brought a new question. What do you do with hundreds of deadly submarines when the war ends? The German fleet, Operation Deadlight. Let's begin with the most dramatic disposal operation in naval history. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, Admiral Karl Dönitz issued a final order to the U-boat fleet, a fleet that had once numbered nearly 500 operational submarines. The order was clear. All U-boats, cease fire at once. Stop all hostile action against Allied shipping. Surrender to the nearest Allied warship. Most captains obeyed, but some refused. In the final week of the war, over 200 U-boat commanders chose to scuttle their own vessels rather than surrender them to the enemy. They opened the sea valves and watched their boats slip beneath the waves, taking with them the pride of the Kriegsmarine. By the time the smoke cleared, 156 U-boats had surrendered to Allied forces. They gathered at ports across Northern Ireland and Scotland. Lissahallie in Northern Ireland and Loch Ryan in Scotland became temporary graveyards for these steel predators. On May 14th, 1945, something remarkable happened. 8 German U-boats entered Lough Foyle, bound for the Royal Naval Jetty at Lissahallie in Northern Ireland. But these weren't attackers. They were prisoners. The U-boats flew the Royal Navy's white ensign from their decks, with British seamen keeping watch over skeleton German crews. The choice of this location was no accident. Northern Ireland had been crucial in the Battle of the Atlantic. The port at Lissahallie had seen more ships pass through than Liverpool, Glasgow, and Belfast combined between 1940 and 1943. But what would the Allies do with these captured submarines? At the Potsdam Conference in August 1945, Churchill, Truman, and Stalin debated their fate. Stalin initially wanted his share kept afloat. The Soviet Navy was eager for German submarine technology, but Churchill insisted they should be destroyed. The compromise? Some submarines would be allocated to the Allied powers for study. 30 U-boats were distributed among the United States, Britain, France, Norway, and the Soviet Union, but the remaining 116 submarines faced a different destiny. On November 17th, 1945, Operation Deadlight began. The plan seemed simple. Tow the U-boats 100 miles northwest of Ireland and sink them in deep water. The Royal Navy would be responsible for the entire operation. But nothing went according to plan. The submarines had been moored in exposed harbors for months, battered by weather and neglect. Many were already in terrible condition. As tugboats began the long tow into the Atlantic, the winter storms proved merciless. 56 U-boats, nearly half the fleet, sank before reaching the designated scuttling area. They broke free from their tow lines, flooded, or simply fell apart in the heavy seas. It was as if the ocean itself was claiming them. For those that made it to the disposal area, the end came by gunfire rather than explosive charges. Royal Navy ships used the U-boats for target practice, their guns thundering across the waves as submarine after submarine slipped beneath the surface. The last U-boat to be sunk was U-3514, a Type 21, one of the most advanced submarines ever built, with revolutionary features that would influence submarine design for decades. On February 12, 1946, at 10:04 a.m., U-3514 received the dubious distinction of being the final vessel sunk in Operation Deadlight. In just 3 months, 116 German U-boats were consigned to the depths. They now rest on the ocean floor, about 100 miles off the Irish coast, in water over 600 feet deep. But here's something fascinating. These sunken U-boats have become valuable in the modern era. The steel in pre-1945 submarines contains no radioactive contamination, unlike metal produced after the atomic age began. This low background steel is incredibly valuable for scientific instruments that need to detect tiny amounts of radiation. In the late 1990s, companies actually applied for salvage rights to raise these U-boats, not for historical value, but for their pristine, uncontaminated metal. Survivors and prizes. Not all German submarines met their end in Operation Deadlight. Several escaped that fate and lived remarkable second lives. Take U-505. On June 4, 1944, she became the first enemy warship boarded and captured by the U.S. Navy since the War of 1812. Captain Daniel Gallery's task force managed to capture her with her Enigma machine and codebooks intact, an intelligence coup that remained classified for decades. Because U-505 was captured in battle, not surrendered after the war, she didn't fall under Operation Deadlight. Admiral Gallery argued successfully to preserve her. Today, she sits as a museum ship at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, a massive steel monument to submarine warfare. U-995 had perhaps the most interesting journey. She was transferred to Norway by the United Kingdom in 1948, where she served as the Norwegian vessel Kaura. In 1965, Germany requested her return, and she became a museum ship at Lebow. She's the only surviving Type 7 U-boat, the workhorse of the German submarine fleet. Over 700 Type 7s were built, and U-995 is the sole survivor. 4 German U-boats were stationed in the Far East when Germany surrendered in May 1945. The Japanese Imperial Navy immediately commandeered them. U-181 became I-501, U-195 became I-506, U-219 became I-506, I-505, and U-862 became I-502. When Japan surrendered 3 months later, these boats were scuttled by Allied forces in various locations across the Pacific. The Pacific Theater, American submarines. Now, let's cross the world to the Pacific, where American submarines had waged a devastating campaign against Japan. The U.S. submarine force was the most effective anti-ship weapon in the American arsenal. Though submarines made up only 2% of the Navy, they destroyed over 30% of the Imperial Japanese Navy and over 60% of Japan's merchant fleet. This strangling of supply lines was arguably as important to victory as any battle. But victory came at a terrible price. 52 American submarines were lost during the war, taking 3,500 submariners with them, a casualty rate of 22%, one of the highest of any branch of the American military. 1 in 5 submariners never came home. When the war ended, the surviving submarines faced different fates than their German counterparts. America had no need for mass disposal. These were their own vessels, and many were still seaworthy. Some submarines became training vessels for the new generation of submariners. Others underwent the Fleet Snorkel Conversion Program, receiving updated equipment to serve through the Cold War years. but many found a different purpose, as memorials. Take the USS Bofin, launched on December 7, 1942, exactly 1 year after Pearl Harbor. She was nicknamed the Pearl Harbor Avenger. During her war patrols, she sank over a dozen enemy vessels and earned the Navy unit citation. After the war, she served until 1971, when she was struck from the Naval Vessel Register. The Bofin could have been scrapped. Instead, in 1980, she was brought back to Pearl Harbor to become a museum ship. Today, visitors can walk her cramped corridors, see where men slept on bunks built over torpedoes, and understand the claustrophobic reality of submarine warfare. USS Pampanito, a Balao-class submarine, now sits at San Francisco's Fisherman's Wharf. She sank 6 Japanese ships and rescued 73 Allied prisoners of war from the water, prisoners who had been aboard Japanese ships she'd torpedoed, not knowing they were there. USS Torsk holds an interesting record. She fired the last torpedoes of World War II, sinking a Japanese coastal defense frigate just hours before the ceasefire. She now serves as a museum ship in Baltimore, Maryland. USS Drum in Mobile, Alabama. USS Razorback in North Little Rock, Arkansas, which has the distinction of being present at Tokyo Bay for the Japanese surrender, literally bookending World War II. USS Silversides in Muskegon, Michigan, the third highest scoring submarine of the war. Today, 25 American submarines serve as museums across the United States. They're not just historical artifacts. They're tombs without bodies, monuments to the 3,500 men who never returned from patrol. At the USS Bofin Museum in Pearl Harbor, 52 plaques surround an American flag, one for each submarine lost. Each plaque lists the names of every crew member who went down with his boat. The Japanese fleet, Operation Road's End. Finally, we come to perhaps the most technologically advanced submarine fleet of World War II and its systematic destruction. The Imperial Japanese Navy operated the most diverse submarine fleet ever assembled. They built submarines that could launch aircraft, submarines faster underwater than any other nation. Massive fleet submarines that could circle the globe, and tiny suicide submarines operated by a single man. Consider these facts. During World War II, there were only 56 submarines larger than 3,000 tons in the entire world. 52 of them were Japanese. Japan built 65 submarines with ranges exceeding 20,000 miles, able to cruise from Japan to Africa and back without refueling. The Allies had no submarine capable of this feat. The I-400 class submarines were true giants, 400 feet long, capable of carrying 3 aircraft with enough fuel to circumnavigate the world 1.5 times. Until 1965, they were the largest submarines ever built. But by 1945, this magnificent fleet lay in ruins. Most had been sunk during the war by Allied forces. Of the approximately 190 submarines built or acquired by Japan during the war, fewer than 50 survived to surrender. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, these remaining submarines faced an uncertain future, and then the Cold War began to dawn. By early 1946, relations between the United States and the Soviet Union were rapidly deteriorating. American military planners grew increasingly concerned that under post-war agreements, the Soviets would demand access to captured Japanese submarines with revolutionary designs that could give the Soviet Navy a tremendous advantage. The decision was made swiftly. All captured Japanese submarines would be destroyed. On March 26, 1946, the U.S. Navy issued orders to sink them all, and so began Operation Road's End. On April 1, 1946, 24 Japanese submarines capable of sailing under their own power, manned by skeleton Japanese crews, departed Sasebo Bay. They were escorted by the destroyer USS Everett F. Larson and other American vessels to a location called Point Deep 6, about 40 miles west of Nagasaki, near the Goto Islands. One by one, they were sunk, some by demolition charges, others by gunfire. The American ships used them for target practice, their 5-inch guns thundering across the Pacific as each submarine met its end. Among those 24 submarines was 402, one of the massive I-400 class aircraft carrier submarines. After all the other vessels had been sunk, I-402 and the submarine HA-201 were lashed together and destroyed as gunnery targets by the USS Everett F. Larson. They sank together at 4:24 p.m., 600 feet down, 16 miles off the coast. But Operation Road's End was just the beginning. 4 days later, on April 5th, Operation Dead Duck disposed of 4 more disabled submarines off Sasebo Bay. Throughout April and May, additional submarines were scuttled in 5 main disposal areas: Maizuru Bay, Key Swedo, the Inland Sea, and off Sasebo. Some submarines received a different fate. 5 of Japan's most advanced submarines, I-14, I-201, I-203, I-400, and I-401, were transported to Pearl Harbor for study and evaluation by American naval engineers. The Americans were particularly interested in these vessels. The I-400 class submarines represented the future of submarine warfare, massive boats capable of launching airstrikes from beneath the waves. The I-200 class submarines were the fastest underwater boats in the world. But in May 1946, once American engineers had learned everything they could, these 5 submarines were deliberately sunk by American submarines off the Hawaiian coast. The knowledge gained from studying them would influence American submarine design for decades. But the submarines themselves could never be allowed to fall into Soviet hands. I-401 was sunk on May 31st by USS Cabazon. The massive submarine now rests in 2,800 feet of water off Barber's Point, Oahu, discovered by deep-sea submersibles in 2005. I-400 was sunk on June 4th by USS Trumpetfish, I-14 on May 28th, I-201 on May 23rd, I-203 on May 21st, all torpedoed and sunk by American submarines, ironically meeting the same fate they had inflicted on so many Allied vessels during the war. By October 1946, General MacArthur's report confirmed that all 151 Japanese submarines had been disposed of. 42 had been scrapped, and 104 had been sunk at sea. The Imperial Japanese Navy's submarine fleet, the most technologically advanced in the world, was gone. The legacy. So what did we lose when these submarines were destroyed? And what did we gain? From a historical perspective, we lost invaluable artifacts. Imagine if just one Type 21 U-boat had been preserved alongside U-995. Imagine if one I-400 class submarine had been saved for future generations to see, those massive aircraft carrier submarines that represented the peak of wartime innovation. But from a strategic perspective, the destruction made sense. In 1945 and 1946, the world was already dividing into Cold War camps. Submarines then ensured no one else would get that knowledge. The technology from these submarines wasn't lost. It evolved. The German Type 21 U-boat, with its streamlined hull and powerful electric motors, became the template for all post-war submarine development. The snorkel technology that allowed submarines to run diesel engines while submerged became standard on all diesel-electric submarines. The Japanese I-400 concept, submarines that could launch aircraft, evolved into submarines that could launch ballistic missiles. Today's ballistic missile submarines are the direct descendants of those massive Japanese vessels. Even the lessons learned from the Type 95 Long Lance torpedo, that oxygen-fueled Japanese torpedo that outranged everything else, influenced torpedo development for decades. Today, many of these sunken submarines have been found again. In 2004, a Canadian film team working with historians located several of the Operation Deadlight U-boats off Ireland. In 2019, the Japanese Coast Guard discovered 24 of the submarines sunk in Operation Road's End off the Goto Islands. These wrecks have become archaeological sites, time capsules of 1940s technology resting on the ocean floor. Some have become dive sites, others remain protected war graves. As for the museum's submarines that survived, they serve a vital purpose. They're tangible connections to the past, places where you can touch the periscope a submariner touched, walk the deck where men stood watch, and feel the confined spaces where crews lived for months at a time. When World War II ended, the world had to decide what to do with thousands of weapons of war. Tanks were melted down, aircraft were scrapped, warships were mothballed or destroyed. But submarines were different. They represented the cutting edge of naval technology, vessels that had changed warfare forever. Some were destroyed to keep their secrets safe. Others were preserved to teach future generations. Today, from Chicago to San Francisco, from Baltimore to Pearl Harbor, from Germany to Russia, museum submarines stand as monuments to the men who served aboard them and the war they fought. 116 German U-boats rest off the coast of Ireland. 104 Japanese submarines lie scattered across the Pacific. Each represents not just lost technology, but lost history and lost lives. The silent fleet is silent no more. Their story continues in museums, in history books, and on the ocean floor, where steel monuments to World War II rest in eternal darkness, 600 feet down, waiting to be remembered. Thank you for watching.